In 1963, a county road inspector named Earl Voss broke a fan belt 40 miles from the nearest town on a gravel road outside Dalhart, Texas. He did not panic. He pulled a balled-up pair of his wife's nylon stockings from the glove box and tied them in a tight 3-knot loop around the pulleys. He drove the whole way home on them. The temperature needle never crossed the middle. That Ford pickup ran 9 more years on its original water pump. He was not a genius. He carried what every careful driver carried then. A spare pair of stockings was a tool. That trick is number 4 on this list. And there is not a driver under 50 today who could even reach the belt to try it. We did not lose this because cars got better. We lost it because the engine became something you were no longer allowed to touch. There was a day when a man could open the hood and see every belt, every hose, every linkage. He fixed half of it with what was in the car and the rest with what was in the house. A torn stocking, a length of wire, a stick of gum. The driver was the first mechanic, and the road was his garage. We traded that for a sealed cover and a tow truck that takes 90 minutes. The complexity was the product. The helplessness was the point. Number 21 was done at the kitchen sink with a thing the family threw away, and it caught the grit that quietly kills a fuel pump. Number 4 got a man 40 miles home on a snapped belt with nothing the factory ever sold him. And number 3, the underhood check every driver once did before a long trip, has vanished because the modern engine is built so you cannot see the parts it was protecting. These 25 tricks were not about being cheap. They were about being ready. About a man who looked at a torn stocking and saw a fan belt, a filter, a dust boot, a toe strap. That kind of seeing has been engineered out of us on purpose. The car told you what it needed. The driver found a way to give it. That conversation has been silenced by 60 years of sealed bays and warning lights. Hit that subscribe button. And let us count down the 25 forgotten 1960s tricks mechanics used pantyhose for that kept cars running forever. Number 25, straining gasoline from a can through a stocking. This was not fussiness. This was protecting a carburetor that cost a week's pay. You stretched the nylon over the funnel and poured the gas through slow. Rust flakes, water beads, road grit, all of it stayed on the mesh. Only clean fuel went into the tank. For a farmer in 1961 who fueled a tractor and a truck from the same barn drums, this was the difference between a running engine and a Sunday spent picking a carburetor apart. Every American carburetor from the 1950s into the 1970s had passages no wider than a pin. One flake of rust shut it down. The nylon caught what no metal screen could. It was not a filter, it was a gatekeeper, and it never let the dirt past. Number 24, the air cleaner pre-filter for dusty roads. A second skin of nylon over the carburetor's intake out where the dust lived. You pulled the stocking over the air cleaner element and snugged it with a rubber band. On a gravel road, the fine nylon caught the powder the paper filter let through. You shook it clean at dusk. A rancher in 1964 drove 20 miles of calichet dust to town every dry summer, and his engine never drank the grit that grinds rings to powder. Detroit built the open-air cleaner for clean suburban air, not a dirt road in August. The factory never planned for dust. The driver did. The paper stopped the big stuff. The nylon stopped what the paper missed.
Before we go on, I made something special for you. A guide for men like us, who still believe a man should be able to keep his own car running. It's the Forgotten Mechanic's Handbook, the old-fashioned car repair secrets our grandfathers used to fix any engine and keep it running for decades. But these skills are disappearing fast. And once they're gone for good. Don't pay another mechanic ever again. Scan the QR code on screen or click the link below. Go ahead, I'll wait right here.
Number 23, the crankcase breather pre-filter, a small piece of nylon over the breather, guarding the oil from the air. You wrapped the stocking around the road draft tube and tied it off. It let the engine breathe, but turned back the airborne dust that would settle straight into the oil and the bearings. A delivery driver in 1959 ran a coal country route all year, and his oil came out cleaner at every change than his fleetmates did. Before sealed crankcase ventilation arrived in the mid-1960s, the engine breathed open to the road. That open tube was a doorway. The nylon was the screen door on it. It cost nothing. It kept dirt out of the one place it does the most harm. Number 22, filtering engine oil as you poured it. The last line of defense before fresh oil met the bearings. You laid the stocking across the filler neck and poured slow. Any grit off a dusty can rim, any fleck from a punctured top, stayed on the mesh instead of riding down onto a crankshaft journal. A long-haul man in 1962 did this at every change on the road where a clean bench was 2 states away and the cans rode in a dusty truck box. Oil filtration then was coarse, and many older engines had no full-flow filter at all. The nylon was finer than the engine itself carried. It was not the oil that wore the engine. It was what rode in with it. Number 21. The fuel line and tank filter sock. A nylon sock over the fuel pickup, catching grit before the pump ever saw it. You slipped a doubled piece of stocking over the pickup tube and let the fuel pull through. The mesh held back the rust and sediment that settles in every old steel tank. A garage man in 1960 fixed a truck that stalled on every hill, not with a new pump, but with a nylon sock on a tank full of 40 years of scale. Steel tanks rusted from the inside, and the inline glass filter was a luxury option through the 1950s. The stocking did the filter's job for nothing. The grit never reached the pump. It stopped at the nylon. Number 20. Straining the coolant as you filled, catching the rust and scale that boils up out of an old cooling system. You poured the coolant through a stocking over the radiator neck. The orange flakes, the chalky scale shed by the block, all of it caught on the mesh instead of packing the radiator's narrow tubes. A station man in 1961 flushed a farmer's overheating Chevy, strained the refill, and gave back a temperature gauge that finally sat where it should. Cast iron blocks and copper radiators shed scale for their whole lives, and a plugged core was the most common overheat there was. The nylon caught the cause before it lodged. A clogged radiator was not bad luck. It was rust nobody strained out. Number 19. Straining transmission fluid on the refill, the same gatekeeping for the most delicate hydraulics in the car. You filtered the fluid through nylon as it went down the dipstick tube, catching any speck before it reached a valve body machined finer than a hair. A fleet mechanic in 1965 did this every time he topped up an automatic, because one piece of grit in a valve body meant a transmission that shifted hard or not at all. Early automatics had crude internal screens and no fine filter at all. The clearances were unforgiving. The nylon kept them clean. It was not the fluid that failed the transmission. It was the one fleck it carried in. Number 18. Covering an open carburetor during work. A nylon cap over the engine's open mouth while the hood was up. You stretched a stocking over the bare carburetor throat while you walked off for a part. It kept the dropped bolt, the dirt off your sleeve, the grit off the bench, from falling straight into a cylinder. An apprentice in 1958 learned this the hard way, after a dropped nut into an open intake cost him a tear down and a week of his boss's silence. A nut in an open port could mean a bent valve the moment the engine turned over. The nylon was a net over the one hole you could not afford to feed. It was not caution for its own sake. It was a man who had paid the price once. Number 17, lint-free polishing of chrome and glass. The nylon that left no thread behind on the surfaces that mattered. You balled up a worn stocking and worked it over fresh chrome, the headlight glass, the inside of the windshield. It cut the haze and the road film and left no lint. A man in 1962 who babied a new Impala did the chrome and glass with his wife's runs every Sunday, and held a shine the neighbors swore was waxed daily. Chrome and clear glass were the face of a car then, and a clean windshield at night was a safety tool, not vanity. The nylon polished without shedding. It was not about looking new, it was about seeing the road and respecting the machine. Here is something nobody is counting. The men who could look at a torn stocking and see a fan belt are nearly all gone. They came up before the sealed cover, before the roadside number on the windshield, before anyone told them a car was too complicated to touch. The youngest are deep into their 70s. They did not keep this in books. They kept it in a way of seeing, a habit of looking at a useless thing and asking what it could become. That cannot be downloaded. It was a reflex built by 1,000 roadside fixes, by being stranded once at 16 and swearing never to be helpless again. The chain ran from a father's hands to a son's, from one stranded driver to the next who watched him improvise. Then the hood got sealed, and the tow truck got a phone number, and the looking stopped. We are writing it down before the last of these men are buried. Number 16, recovering a dropped bolt from deep in the engine. Nylon over a vacuum hose, turning the engine's own suction into a hand. You pulled a piece of stocking over the end of a hose, hooked the other end to a vacuum source or your own breath, and fished down into the valley where the bolt had fallen. The mesh let the suction grab the bolt and hold it as you drew it up. A mechanic in 1960 saved an afternoon this way, pulling a head bolt out of a blind crevice no finger or magnet could reach. Brass and aluminum bolts would not answer a magnet, and the deep valleys of a big V8 swallowed, dropped hardware whole. The nylon caught what steel tools could not. It was not a special tool. It was a stocking, a hose, and a man who would not pull the intake to find one bolt. Number 15, a temporary dust boot for a ball joint or tie rod. Nylon wrapped over a torn rubber boot to keep grit out of the grease. You cut a band of stocking, wrapped it around the joint, and tied it tight over the split boot. It held the grease in and the dirt out until a proper part could wait its turn. A farmer in 1963 nursed a worn front end through harvest this way, because a tie rod is not something you replace in the middle of getting the crop in. A torn boot let grit in and turned a part that lasted a decade into one that failed in a month. The nylon bought the time the season demanded. It was not a repair, it was a tourniquet. Number 14, lashing wiring and lines off the hot exhaust. Nylon ties holding the wires clear of the manifold that would melt them. You used twisted lengths of stocking to bind a sagging harness or a fuel line up and away from the exhaust manifold. The nylon held until you could fit a proper clamp. A garage man in 1961 found a fuel line drooping onto a header and tied it up with a stocking before it dripped onto the heat. A line against a hot manifold was how a car burned to the frame in a parking lot. The nylon held it clear, cheap, and fast. It was not a permanent fix. It was a man seeing the fire before it started. Number 13, the temporary linkage keeper. Nylon holding a throttle or choke rod in place after a clip let go. You looped a doubled piece of stocking through the linkage hole where the cotter pin had fallen out and knotted it snug. It held the rod on its ball stud well enough to drive home and well past it. A traveling salesman in 1964 lost a throttle clip on a dark county road, tied the linkage with a stocking, and drove 300 miles on the knot. Throttle and choke rods rode on simple clips that rattled loose on rough roads. A lost clip stranded you. The nylon stood in for it. It was not the part the factory specified, it was the part the driver had, and it got him home. Number 12, cooling a vapor-locked fuel pump. A wet nylon laid over a hot pump to break the lock and get fuel moving again. You soaked a stocking in water from a canteen or a ditch, laid it over the fuel pump and line, and let it draw the heat off. The fuel cooled, the lock cleared, the engine caught. A driver crossing the Mojave in 1959 carried water for the radiator and a stocking for the pump, and never sat stranded in the heat shimmer like the cars beside him. Mechanical pumps mounted low and hot, and a summer climb boiled the fuel right in the line. The wet nylon was a cold compress for an engine running a fever. It was not magic. It was a man who knew heat made the trouble, and cool made it leave. Number 11, finding a split radiator or heater hose. Nylon wrapped tight over a patch to hold pressure and reach town. You wrapped a stocking around the split, layer over layer, pulling each pass tight, and knotted it hard. The nylon stretched and gripped, holding the coolant pressure long enough to reach help. A family on a 1962 vacation split a heater hose in the mountains, wrapped it in stockings from the suitcase, and rolled into the next town. Rubber hoses hardened and split with heat, and a burst hose dumped your coolant in a minute. The nylon held the pressure no tape could. It was not a new hose. It was 30 more miles, which was exactly enough. Number 10, tying up a dragging exhaust to limp home. Nylon as a sling for a tailpipe that broke its hanger. You looped a stocking around the dragging pipe and tied it up to the frame, lifting it clear of the road. It held the weight, took the heat, and stopped the shower of sparks. A young couple in 1965 broke an exhaust hanger far from home, slung the pipe with stockings, and drove in quiet instead of dragging steel down the highway. Exhaust hangers rusted and snapped, and a pipe on the pavement was sparks, noise, and a hole worn through in miles. The nylon held it up where a chain would have rattled. It was not a welder's fix. It was a sling that took the heat and got them off the shoulder. Number 9, the parts washer solvent strainer. Nylon over the solvent return, catching the sludge so the wash stayed clean. You stretched a stocking over the mouth of the solvent tank's return, and the grime, the carbon, the metal fines all stayed on the mesh. The solvent went back clear and washed the next part clean. A shop owner in 1958 strained his solvent through old stockings every week and made a drum last 3 times as long as the shop down the road. Solvent was a real cost in a working garage, and dirty solvent only smeared the grime around. The nylon pulled the dirt out and gave the cleaner back. It was not thrift for its own sake. It was a man who wasted nothing. There is a reason no one teaches you to look at a car this way. Follow the money. The dealership service network in this country pulls in over $116 billion a year in repair and maintenance. That number depends on you reaching for a phone, not a glove box. In 2021, the right to repair movement won a partial victory in Massachusetts, forcing automakers to share diagnostic data with independent shops. The industry spent more than $25 million fighting it, and they are fighting still. A driver who can sling an exhaust with a stocking and strain his own fuel is a driver who does not call. The sealed engine cover is not there to protect the engine, it is there to protect the invoice. They did not make the car too complex to fix. They made it too closed to try. Number 8. Straining paint and primer before spraying. Nylon is the cheapest fine filter a body man ever used. You stretched a doubled stocking over the cup of the spray gun and poured the paint through. The mesh caught every speck and skin that would have spat through the nozzle and ruined the panel. A body man in 1960 strained every cup through his daughter's old stockings and laid down fenders so smooth the dealer thought they came from the factory. A single fleck meant a fisheye or a run, and a panel sanded back and shot again. The nylon mesh was finer than any paper strainer sold. It was not vanity. It was a man who would not let one speck cost him a day's work. Number 7. Reading a machined surface for burrs. Nylon dragged over a journal or bore to feel what the eye could not see. You pulled a stretched stocking lightly across a crankshaft journal or a freshly honed cylinder wall. A burr, a scratch, a high spot would snag the nylon and pull a thread, marking the flaw your fingertip had missed. A machinist in 1957 checked every reground crank this way, because a burr he missed was a bearing that failed in 1,000 miles. The tolerances inside an engine were measured in 10,000ths, and a flaw too small to see was large enough to destroy a bearing. The nylon found it by catching on it. It was not a gauge. It was a way of feeling the metal with something more honest than skin. Number 6. Checking valve stems and guides for roughness. The same trick turned to the valve train. You ran a piece of nylon down a valve stem and along the guide. A score, a galled spot, a ridge of wear would grab the mesh and tell you the part was finished before you ever assembled the head. A rebuild man in 1959 checked every stem this way because a rough stem stuck in its guide and bent a push rod the first time the engine ran hot. Valves ran in close guides at high heat for the life of the engine, and a galled stem was a hidden failure waiting for the first hard mile. The nylon dragged it into the light. It was not a special instrument, it was a stocking, and a man who trusted his hands over his eyes. Number 5. The temporary generator belt. When the belt that drove the charging system let go, the nylon stood in. You knotted a doubled length of stocking around the generator and crank pulleys, snug but not screaming tight, and let it turn the charging system home. It would not last forever, but it would reach a parts store. A traveling nurse in 1963 lost her generator belt at midnight, tied it with stockings, and drove on the battery and the nylon until the sun and the next town came up together. Generators and the early alternators rode on the same fragile belts, and a broken one meant a dead battery in an hour. The nylon kept the charge alive. It was not the belt the car was born with. It was the belt that got it to the one for sale. Number 4. The emergency fan belt. The famous one. The trick that turned a torn stocking into the part that saved the engine. You looped the stocking around the water pump and crank pulleys, pulled it as tight as your hands could draw it, and tied it in a hard triple knot near the pulley face. It drove the fan and the pump well enough to hold the temperature down for a long, careful drive. That road inspector outside Dalhart in 1963 drove 40 miles of gravel on a knotted pair, and the needle never moved off center. The fan belt drove the cooling, and a broken one meant a boiled engine in minutes on a hot day. The nylon stretched and gripped where rope would slip. It was not a belt. It was a woman's stocking, a man's two hands, and an engine that refused to be left on the shoulder. Number 3, the pre-trip belt and hose check. The habit that put the spare stocking in the glove box in the first place. You opened the hood before a long trip, squeezed every hose for the soft spot of rot, and twisted the belts to read the cracks on the underside. You looked for the seep that warns of a leak to come. Then you checked the spare pair was still in the box. A father in 1961 did this before every family trip, on his knees at the bumper, because a breakdown with children in the car 200 miles from home was the thing he feared most. Belts and hoses gave warning before they failed, a crack, a soft spot, a weep for anyone who looked. The modern sealed cover hides the very parts this check was built to read. It was not paranoia. It was a man reading the engine while it was still cheap to listen. Number 2, the weekly under-hood walk. Keeping the engine honest, the way a station man once did for free. You lifted the hood on a Sunday, looked over the belts and hoses and clamps, and checked the spare stockings, the wire, the tape in the box. 5 minutes kept every roadside trick a trick you would never need. A station man in 1958 sent every regular home with this habit, treating the driver as the engine's first and nearest mechanic. The weekly look the full-service station taught was gone by the 80s, traded for a warning light that speaks last instead of first. It was not the fix that saved the car. It was the man who looked before the car ever asked to be fixed. Number 1, carrying the spare pair. That is all. The single habit underneath every other trick on this list. You kept a pair of stockings in the glove box the way you kept a jack in the trunk. Not because you expected to break a belt today, but because the man who carried the fix was never the man stranded on the shoulder. A belt, a filter, a boot, a sling, a strainer, all of it lived in one balled-up pair behind the maps. Your grandfather did this without calling it preparation. He called it being ready. A lifetime of it, and he never once sat helpless beside a dead engine waiting for someone to save him. We replaced the spare pair with a phone number and a 90-minute wait, and we call it progress every time we use it. Number 1 is not a trick. It is the readiness underneath every trick on this list. None of these tricks required a special tool, apart from the dealer, or a single thing the factory had to sell you. They required a willingness to look at a torn stocking and see a fan belt, a filter, a toe strap, a dust boot. That kind of seeing was the default setting of every garage and every glove box in America. Not cleverness born from training, cleverness born from intimacy, from enough hours with engines that you stopped seeing junk and started seeing parts. It got a man 40 miles home on a snapped belt in the hands of people who never finished high school. We did not lose the tricks. The hoses still split. The belts still break. The grit still finds the carburetor. What we lost is the hood you could open, the belt you could reach, and the habit of carrying the fix before you needed it. We lost the man who looked at a useless thing and made it save the day. He is gone now, and most of what he knew went with him, sealed under a plastic cover with a label that says to leave it to the dealer. But not all of it is buried. Some of it is here, written down at last, before the last of those men were gone. The next time a belt squeals or a hose weeps, do not just reach for the phone. Open the hood. Look at what you have. The craft is not dead. It is waiting in a glove box for someone to remember what a torn stocking can do.